Hi there everyone. Welcome to the second video for week 9. In this video, we're going to continue the theme of the previous video and talk a lot more about Leibniz's concept of monads, or what he also calls individual substances. So everything that we said in the last video will be basically assumed in this video. And so what was said in last video is that monads, or individual substances, are the sort of basic stuff of the universe. They're what it means to have a soul or a mind. Remember that for Leibniz is an idealist in the sense that he believes that bodies do not have independent existence from minds. So like whenever we conceive of a body, that's just how we imagine a big aggregate together. And because it's imaginative, things are not really that way. So from that, we know that the basic stuff of the universe is not bodies, but minds. And that from this framework, we can see that, in order to understand a mind, we have to see how it is the subject of predication. So, in other words, whenever you say Penelope is a philosopher or pursues philosophy or something to that effect, then we must be able to see the connection, in this case, between me, Penelope, and the predicate, which is pursuing philosophy. And whenever we have real, perfect, adequate knowledge of things, we can see the connection between the subject and the predicate. In the same way that in geometrical knowledge, I'm able to know from the nature of a triangle, for example, that it will have 3 sides or something like that, right? And so basically, for Leibniz, God has a mathematical exactness to his knowledge of our minds, which means that he can know simply from our essence everything that will ever happen to us. And in fact, there are marks, in an important sense, of everything that happens in the entire universe, right? How so? Well, just to reiterate very briefly, if you wanted to really know why I decided to pursue philosophy, then you'll have to make reference to a whole bunch of events that happened in the world. I was an undergrad and I decided to take a philosophy class, and then I was encouraged by various other people, and so on. And if those events would have been different, then presumably, I would have been different in important ways. And so that's to say that these facts about myself, these facts about my own life history, are intimately tied into the structure of the world. Why? Well, in part because of the principle of sufficient reason. Everything happens for a reason. So it's not possible to just pluck out one event of the universe from the entire causal series. No, you have to change the entire series itself, right? And so in Leibniz's view of the world, God doesn't come in and change individual events in the universe because this is inconceivable, right? It just wouldn't make sense for all the things that caused me to be a philosopher to still be true, and there'd be no, bigger reason, more compelling reason, and then for me not to pursue it. It would have to be like a weird, exceptional spot or moment in the structure of the universe, which Leibniz thinks he's already proven cannot happen from the principle of sufficient reason. So, really what we're going to be doing today is just examining and interrogating the consequences of this view for your understanding of the whole world, right? How, what is the world like if we say that it's composed of these individual substances and that bodies aren't real? and all of this kind of stuff. And so if in the last video we really zoomed in to a particular passage and provided a close reading of it, and that provided sort of the foundations of our approach in the previous video, in this video, to the contrary, we're going to zoom out, right? We're going to get a picture not of what Leibniz thought about metaphysical laws or physical laws, or, you know, what he said in the discourse or something like that. We want to get a bigger, broader picture of like what the universe is like according to Leibniz. So up at the top I've written Leibniz's Monadology, or the world. On the left, I have given us here a little picture. I believe that this is what essentially the universe looks like for Leibniz. This will be an unimportant aside for those of you who are not interested in art, but for those of you who are, many people, philosophers, in particular I'm thinking of Gilles Deleuze, he has linked Leibniz's conception of the universe with a Baroque painting. So if you know anything about the style of painting, it is composed to direct your view sort of to the top of the image. So it intentionally kind of like forms a cone structure, as we can see in this case. Sometimes people, like Deleuze has a funny moment where he makes fun of Leibniz's hair, because Leibniz's hair, you know, he's got one of those silly wigs that points straight up, right? The bigger the hair, the closer to God. And we're going to see that this sort of hierarchical structure, this kind of like funneling structure that we see going on here, this is very, very important to Leibniz's whole conception of what the universe is like. And the way that I've written it here is that you can imagine that the individual points are monads, right? They are the individual substances that are the reflections of the universe. But what we're going to see, what we're going to examine in more depth and try to understand, is that even though all of these monads are just sort of like reflections of the same thing, that they nonetheless are distinct from one another. In that way, we're going to have to contrast Leibniz's view with a view that looks a lot like it, which is atomism, right? The belief that, you know, in nature there is sort of like a smallest single you know, building block of the whole universe, and that is an atom, right? Our own like new physical conceptions, we found an atom and then we found subatomic components and so on, right? But the meaning of the word atom is to refer to something indivisible, right? So we thought we got there with the atom, but it turns out that no, the atom is actually further divisible into even tinier parts. So what is that to say? So for Leibniz has a view that's very close to atomism, right? It's very close to saying that there's this sort of like basic stuff that makes up the universe. They are individual in a certain kind of way, in the way the atoms are individual, and when they come together, they compose the, you know, enormous, immense diversity and complexity of the natural world that we see and hear and understand and deal with in our day-to-day lives. So even though atoms are supposed to be simple, they don't have any parts. It's not like we could distinguish them any further. For Leibniz, we're going to see that all monads are qualitatively distinct from one another. So in other words, they're not distinct from one another because they have different parts or something like that. They're distinct from one another in terms of what Leibniz calls their intensive magnitude. So their ability to represent and to be affected by the world. we're going to talk more about what this means in just a moment. So that's just to give you sort of like a cursory overview, give you some way to like see and understand this weird little graph that I've drawn, and we'll go more into these specific distinctions in just a moment. Instead, the way that we're going to proceed immediately is we're going to focus on the things on this other side of the board, which are quotes from various points in the monadology. So number one, Leibniz says, monads are the true atoms of nature and, in brief, the elements of things. So here, you have the explicit comparison to atomism, right? Physical atomism. Physical atomism, just says that there are atoms, and those atoms compose the various bodies that we see. And importantly, those atoms don't have a mind, right? Like most people, like Democritus, if you've taken ancient Greek philosophy, did not think about atoms as like having minds or having perceptions or anything like that. They're just the smallest part that you can have of a body. Now, kind of the first objection that Leibniz makes to this view is that it would violate the principle of sufficient reason. Why would it violate the principle of sufficient reason? Well, for Leibniz, you can have a number line, say, and it can go from 0 to 1, right? Importantly, this number line is infinitely divisible, right? So this has an infinite number of points in it, right? Because you could go 0.000001, 0.000002, right? And so on and so forth as long as you want. It's infinitely divisible. So too, you could find, say, an infinite number of points in the distance from 0 to 0.5, and so on and so forth, right? You can just keep doing that infinitely. You can keep dividing a number line and finding an infinite number of points between whatever you designate, right? And why can you do this according to Leibniz? Well, you can do it for the principle of sufficient reason. It's not like there's anything stopping you from doing it in this case versus this case. There's nothing that stops the division, you know what I mean? So given that, you need a reason for, why you can stop, why you can kind of like halt the division. And in the case of physical atoms, Leibniz thinks, well, the essence of bodies is just to be an aggregate. So you can always divide further, and again, here you can see how Leibniz in some ways anticipates post-Newtonian developments in physics, right? There are subatomic particles. Those subatomic particles are themselves divisible, right? And so Leibniz's picture is that you never find an end. There's never a point where you just reach the rock bottom level of existence where you can go no further. To the contrary, Leibniz believes genuinely that we exist in an infinite universe. So in other words, just as I can look at any level of scale in this number line, so too the universe exists at all levels of scale. So it's not like there's a foundational layer, and in this foundational layer you have the real bona fide stuff, and that everything higher than that is a composite. No, all of it's compositional, right? We think in terms of atoms and so on because there is a limitation to our ability to perceive. But there's not a limitation in the essence of matter that prevents it from being further divided. And so for Leibniz, the idea of a physical atom as being something, where you can divide, further, a sort of bedrock, lowest level of physical reality does not exist, because all physical realities only exist in minds. one way that Leibniz tries to contest atomism as sort of like a picture of the universe is he says, atomism sort of conceives of like the universe as being a bag, right? And a bag that you fill up with marbles. And the marbles shift around and they communicate motion, and that's basically, a small model for what goes on in the universe. And in particular, that's a very good model for what happens in an atomistic universe, right? Because just as in the atomistic model of nature, there's a smallest zero level of reality where things take on particular shapes, so too in the metaphor, there are marbles, right? And those marbles constitute like the smallest possible level of matter on that analogy, right? And so, really, the dimension of this picture that Leibniz wants to contest is its model. Leibniz says, a better model of the universe would be, to fill the sack with liquid, right? And the reason why is because liquid, it forms a plenum in the way that, other things do. So in other words, like if you fill up the sack enough, it'll be completely filled with water. There's not like these little empty spaces, as in the case of marbles. And so you get a more accurate depiction of like how motion is communicated, right? Because in the case of liquid, motion is communicated throughout. You can see sort of like the rippling of the waves, for example, on a lake or something like that. And this is much closer to how Leibniz thinks the universe works. In other words, the individual parts don't just like communicate as solids to other parts that are, for the most part not in motion, but they will be in motion under certain circumstances. To the contrary, for Leibniz, the universe is always in a kind of motion, right? In the way that liquid stabilizes when it's put in a container. And the motion that is imparted to even one element, one dimension, one part of that universe is communicated, throughout. And so when Leibniz says that monads are the true atoms of nature, they are the simple substances. They're the stuff that's not in aggregate. And so they're the elements of things, not in the sense of like physical stuff is made out of monads or something like that, but that they are the zero level of the universe. That, monads have no parts, so you can't divide further, and there's no hope of arriving at, smallest parts in terms of bodies because their essence is to be aggregates. So this is really the stuff that really actually exists in the universe, according to Leibniz. Now, the second point is very important. Leibniz also claims that it is also necessary that each monad be different from each other. In other words, part of what is part of the atomistic picture that Leibniz is trying to contest is that atoms don't have any internal differentiation, right? Bodies are composed of parts. That's what makes them a body. And that even belongs to the notion of a body according to Descartes. If it's extended, you can divide it, right? But according to what Leibniz has already maintained in Primary Truths and other texts, namely the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, it's not conceivable that things be distinguished only through relations. And that is exactly what the atomistic picture asks us to imagine. Namely that, one atom is composed in the exact same way as other atoms, and they're directly interchangeable for one another, and that's why they're able to compose stuff together. But if Leibniz's principle of the identity of the indiscernibles is correct, then everything in the universe, according to the principle of sufficient reason, must be able to be internally differentiated from one another. And so if Leibniz wants to overcome this atomistic picture or conception of the universe, then there must be something that internally differentiates every monad from every other monad. And it turns out that what this differentiating element is going to be is it's going to be perceptions. And this is the way that monads are minded. So they're not like atoms. Monads aren't just part of the universe, they perceive the universe. They, in other words, have a standpoint or a relation to what the universe is like in general. And that is why, in terms of this graph, each monad is, you might be tempted to say, topologically distinct from every other monad. Topos just means space. So to say something is topologically distinct is just to say they're distinct from one another in virtue of their perspective from one another. In other words, Leibniz will often reach for this metaphor where it's like each monad expresses the universe in the same way that you can take multiple different perspectives on a city, and those perspectives cohere with one another. So too, Leibniz thinks the perspectives of monads cohere in a certain kind of harmony with one another. But even though they're all about the same thing, even though we're all seeing, say, the same city, they can nonetheless be totally distinct from one another in terms of being different perspectives on that city. So monads are not only distinguished from one another according to spatial location or something like that. That's how atoms would be distinct from one another, and that would fail the principle of the identity of indiscernibles test. Instead, monads are distinct from one another in terms of their perceptions, and in particular according to the quality of these perceptions. Now, Leibniz thinks perception is inexplicable in terms of mechanical reasons, and his explanation is this: there's no amount or no configuration of forces in bodies that produces a representation. Right? So what do I mean? Well, I can't imagine anything happening in the physical universe that would produce a perception. Right? I like, no matter how hard I try, if I imagine, atoms and molecules or whatever mashing up against one another and communicating force and so on, it's inconceivable to me still how any of that stuff could produce a perception of the universe. And so if we want to understand the perception of monads, we have to turn away from a physical account that would deal with bodies and motions and maybe now brains or something like that. And instead we have to go to metaphysics, right? We have to go to not just how the physical world shows up to us, but also how it fundamentally is. So this is where Leibniz developed something like a hierarchy of monads. And Leibniz was an early proponent is not exactly right. Not discoverer is not right either. Leibniz is one of the earliest people to recognize the importance of microorganisms. So like he had seen germs and things like that, and he was very impressed that life happens at a completely different level of scale than what we have the ability to see or perceive or understand. And he thought, oh yeah, what this shows is that my critique of atomism is totally true, right? Yes, it is true that we can't see at the level of like skin cells or something like that, but God's, order, harmony, etc. is so wonderful that there's levels of life at every layer of scale. That doesn't mean that everything's alive, but it means that there is life everywhere in God's world. But these monads, these kinds of life, can take on qualitatively different forms. So Leibniz imagines, just looking at our own sensory perceptual apparatus, it's like our ability to see and perceive things is related to, say, our eyes or our brains or so on, right? And so Leibniz imagines that he is justified in believing that, maybe at the level of single-celled organisms, that they are bare monads. In other words, they don't see anything distinctly at all, right? All of life is sort of an indeterminate haze. And Leibniz thinks, actually, we are in this state too when we're in a dreamless sleep. When we're in a dreamless sleep, we don't stop thinking, we don't stop perceiving. There's still something that it's like to be in a dreamless sleep, but then we don't have distinct perceptions of anything. The next level is the level of animals. So, maybe you rise to a certain level of complexity in biological organisms, and you get more developed sensory perceptual apparatuses. You get things like, mouths and noses and eyes and ears and so on, and they can be pretty sensitive in the case of animals, right? And so in this case, you clearly perceive some things. Some things show up as slightly more distinct than other things, and there's a lot of qualitative differentiation among animals, right? We can imagine the most basic kinds of animals having very different kinds of perceptions than, say, a great ape or a dolphin or something like that, right? An animal that we imagine to have an almost comparable level of perceptions. And then a further qualitative change happens as you attain an additional degree of complexity, right? Your brain gets more developed, you get a vastly expanded prefrontal cortex. And then here we enter the domain of rational spirits. And so in this case, you not only reflect the world in how you perceive it, like say a mirror or something like that, right? But now you begin to discern and understand the underlying reasons for why things are the way that they are, right? So maybe instead of just being scared when you see a slope because you remember falling or something like that, you understand the reason. It's like, oh, okay, well, physical interactions happen this way, it's at this level of slope, and my distribution of weight is like this, right? And so if I want to not fall, then I can only approach slopes at such and such angle or something like that, right? The point is that you go from this hazy, indeterminate, empirical understanding of stuff to a rational understanding of things. And when you reach this rational level, Leibniz thinks you enter the city of God. And what does he mean by that? Well, it's not only like you're an irrational thing that just has to express the universe or reflect it in a certain way. Now you get to understand it. And in that way, you get to kind of participate in it, right? Your understanding of, say, mathematical formula or something like that, when you genuinely understand something, for Leibniz, you are partaking in God, right? You're partaking, you're understanding, you're conceiving the rational order or harmony between nature. And in that way, you take on a God-like perspective. So Leibniz has this highly dynamic view where, the whole universe is sort of ordered according to different perspectives that we can have on it. But over time, these perspectives change. Things that are bare monads, single-celled organisms, might eventually, on Leibniz's conception, become animals. And animals, in turn, when they die, he imagines, sort of gets relegated to only being those cells in the brain that are still alive. And so Leibniz thinks, the order and harmony of nature is such that all of these monads ranged in different perspectives that they have on the universe are able to qualitatively change and appreciate the order in a multitude of different ways throughout their whole life. And in that way, that's the closest they get to an internal relationship with God. And so you can see how Leibniz's physics, Leibniz's metaphysics, Leibniz's mathematics, Leibniz's religion sort of all come together in this general, very sci-fi-esque picture of the world. And there are other ways that the universe could have cohered, right? Different perspectives that we could have had on the universe. But God selected this one in particular because it was the best. Okay, I hope that is interesting to you all. I don't want to keep you all for too long. Thank you so much for paying attention. Thank you for your hard work on the midterms. I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Bye.